You know, in the early 1900s, there was a man you may not have heard of by the name of Edward Kimball. Edward Kimball was a Sunday school teacher in Boston. He was not a famous preacher. He was not a theologian. He didn't write a book as far as I'm aware. In fact, by most accounts, Edward Kimball was a timid, quiet man. But one day, he felt a burden to share the gospel to a young shoe salesman that was in his class. And so Kimball walked into the shoe store where this young man worked to share the gospel with him. And later, after the fact, he admitted that he questioned the act several times before doing it. In fact, several times he thought about turning back around and not going into the store. He felt awkward. He felt unqualified. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to say. But finally, he stepped into that little room and he told that young man the story of Jesus Christ. And that young shoe salesman gave his life to the Lord that day. His name was Dwight L. Moody. He would go on to become one of the foremost evangelists of his time. What's interesting is that in that moment, in the moment Kimball walked into the shoe store, neither the young man he was going to talk to or Kimball himself knew what God was fully doing. Again, to Kimball, it probably felt like just another ordinary conversation. But God was working behind the scenes in ways bigger than either of them could imagine. You know, one of the hardest parts of the Christian life is that we often cannot see what God is doing while we're in the middle of the struggle. Right? We see the delays. We see the interruptions. We see the suffering. We see closed doors and dead ends. But God is often doing his deepest work in the moments that make the least sense to us. And that's exactly what we see here in Mark chapter 5. You see, in this passage, we're going to meet two desperate people whose situations seem hopeless. And yet, through the delays, through the interruptions, through the fear, through even death itself, Jesus reveals that he is still completely in control. So Mark chapter 5, we're starting in verse 21. If you're with me, say word. All right, let's get into it. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." And he, that's Jesus, went with him. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, "If I touch even his garments, I will be made well." And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around us, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Now, while he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. And they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside, took the child's father and mother, and those who were with him, and went in where the child was. And taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age, and they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and he told them to get her something to eat. The first thing I want us to see this morning, church, is we need to see the reality of our dead ends. See the reality of our dead ends. Let me just set the stage for our passage for a moment. If you remember, a few weeks ago, we looked at the beginning of this chapter. Jesus has just crossed the Sea of Galilee, right? You remember, he calmed the storm, and then he landed on the other side, and he met a crazy, naked, demon-possessed man who was living amongst the tombstones, who was wailing and cutting himself. And so Jesus cast the demons out of the man, and they flee into a herd of nearby pigs. And then just thousands of pigs go running off the cliff and drowning in the water. As you can imagine, the people of the area are kind of ticked about losing their pigs, and they tell Jesus to leave. But the man who Jesus has set free, the man who was possessed by demons, is completely transformed. Right? We see it at the end. He's now clothed. He is in his right mind, and he's sitting at the feet of Jesus. And he begs Jesus to take him with him, to let him go on the boat. But Jesus tells him no. Right? He says in verse 19, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." And then we see the result, verse 20. "And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled." Right, so that this is all happening leading into our text this morning. And so verse 21 says, "And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea." So now Jesus has gotten back in a boat. He's gone back across the Sea of Galilee. He's likely returned to where he previously was, which is most likely the region of Capernaum. And just as before, the crowds have flocked back to him. Verse 22 says, "As he arrived, then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet." So we're now introduced to a new man. All right, this man's name is Jairus. We're told that he is one of the rulers of the synagogue. That means that he was likely a prominent lay official. He was someone who would have been responsible for the administration and the worship of the local Jewish community. That means he would have been known. Right? He would have been someone who was recognized. And so we know the man's name. We know his job. What else do we know about Jairus here? Well, we know he's been looking for Jesus. You can get the sense in this passage that he's just been scanning the crowds. He's been looking for even the tiniest glimpse of Jesus. And what else does this verse tell us about Jairus? We learn that he's desperate. Why do we say that? Because when he sees Jesus, what does he do? He falls at his feet. Think about that. One of the rulers of the synagogue abases himself on the ground, in the dirt, in front of a very public, very large crowd. This is not a man who is concerned about his pride. He's not concerned about the opinions of others. He's past all of that. Why? Verse 23 says, "He fell at his feet, and he implored him earnestly, saying, My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live. Jairus didn't just fall down before Jesus. He fell at his feet. It says that he was imploring him. He was begging him. Why? Right? What has driven this highly respected man of great consequence into such a state of unconcerned desperation? He says, my little daughter is at the point of death. Can you put yourself in his shoes? Can you be Jairus this morning? Can you feel the weight that this man is carrying upon himself right now? Mothers in this room today, what wouldn't you do to save your child? And Jairus doesn't just say his child. He doesn't use the Greek word thygater, which would have meant his daughter. He uses the word thygatrion. This is his little daughter. Right? There's an intimacy here. There's a deep affection. This is not just his child. This is my baby. This is my little girl. And what's wrong with her? She's dying. Only he doesn't even say she's dying. He uses a figure of speech here. He says she's at death's door. She's sinking fast. And Jairus tells Jesus that his baby girl is dying. And he asks him to come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live. Verse 24 says, and he, that's Jesus, went with him. Jairus begs Jesus to come, and Jesus responds. He goes. Verse 24 continues, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. So Jesus is now following Jairus, but the crowd has not dissipated, right? The crowd is following along with them. This is like reality TV, right? They want to see how the show ends. Verse 25, there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years. So now we met Jairus. Now we're introduced to a new person, a woman. We don't know her name, but we are told that she's had a discharge of blood for 12 years. So it's not known exactly what this medical issue was, whether it was some sort of continuous uterine hemorrhage or a severe menstrual disorder. But we do know that this has been happening for 12 years. And in verse 29, Mark describes her condition with the word mastix, which literally translates as whip or torment. And so we know that this has been pain, this has been suffering. Right, verse 26 says that she had suffered much under many physicians, and that she had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. So get this, she's gone to everyone and everywhere she can to try and fix this problem, but she can't. In fact, instead of fixing the problem, it's only gotten worse. And she has driven herself into poverty in her many failed attempts trying to find a solution. I mean, can you imagine the defeat and the desperation that this woman is feeling? Physically speaking, she's been enduring immense suffering. However, it's not just the physical suffering, but under Jewish law, in accordance to Leviticus 15, her physical condition made her ritually, ceremonially unclean. This means that for the entirety of these 12 long years that she's been enduring, she has lived as a social outcast. She has been unable to enter the temple. She has been shunned by society, by contact with others, even family, lest she make them unclean. So we have two people here, a man and a woman, both of them in desperate situations, both of them experiencing the reality of dead ends. Right? Those moments when we have exhausted all of our human resources and where we have nowhere else to go. And what we can see is that dead ends in life are no respecter of persons. Jairus' status as a leader in the synagogue did not prevent him from experiencing hardship. Notice the contrast in these two people. Right? We're told in verse 42 that Jairus' daughter is 12 years old. So Jairus has been in a respected place of position and wealth and enjoying the life of his daughter for the past 12 years. Meanwhile, during the exact same time period, this woman has been enduring physical torment, social condemnation, religious isolation, and yet both of these people find themselves in a place of desperation, lying at the feet of Jesus. What can we take away from this passage this morning? Let me give you a couple things here. First, when you come to Jesus, you have to cast off your dignity and pride. Just as Jairus surrendered all of his dignity in order to fall at Jesus' feet, you and I have to do the same. You cannot approach Jesus at an arm's distance. We are called to surrender. You do not surrender with your head held high. You surrender with your knees bent low. Ask yourself this morning, what dignity, what reputation am I trying to hold on to that is preventing me from falling down at the feet of Jesus? Secondly, we need to stop looking to human means to fix heavenly sorrows. This woman had suffered greatly. She spent all that she had, and yet we are told she did not get better. In fact, she got worse. Church, what do you do with your struggles? What have you spent all of your physical, emotional, financial resources on, only to find that your scourge, your torment, has only grown worse? Don't look to human means for answers. Go to the only one who succeeds when everything else fails. Grab your problems and run with them to Jesus. 3, bring your shame and your uncleanness to Jesus. There is a heavy focus on uncleanness in this passage. You have the woman's condition, and then you have even Jairus, who, if his daughter is to die, will be considered unclean for touching a corpse. And yet Jairus is begging Jesus to come and to lay his hands on his daughter. The woman is willing to violate social and religious taboos. Why? All because they had heard of Jesus. You know, there may be some of you here this morning and you might feel spiritually unclean. Yeah, you're in the church, but you feel right now like a spiritual outcast. And I need you to hear this morning that you can bring your uncleanness, your filthiness to Jesus. He is the Lord of hopeless causes. And he does not recoil from your filth. He does not recoil from your dirt, but instead he reaches down and he cleanses us whole. And so bring your sin, bring your shame to Jesus. Let him cleanse you and make you new. We've seen the reality of dead ends, but secondly, church, we need to see the necessity of persistent faith through delays. The necessity of persistent faith through delays. Look at verse 27 with me. It says, she had heard the report about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, if I touch even his garments, I will be made well. And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, who touched my garments? And his disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing around us, and yet you say, who touched me? And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. Again, church, this woman has been ceremonially unclean for 12 years. And yet, where do we find her in this passage, right? Where does verse 27 say? It says that she heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment, right? This poor, desperate, suffering woman, this woman with no hope, with no finances, who's tried everything and found nothing, has heard about Jesus. And she thought to herself, maybe, right? Maybe this is the one. Maybe if I can just get to him, if I can just touch his clothes, just maybe he can heal me. Notice she doesn't copy Jairus. She doesn't call out Jesus' name and run up to him and fall down at his feet. Why? Because she's not supposed to be there. She's not supposed to be in the crowd. She's not supposed to be bumping up against and touching everybody. She's breaking every social and religious protocol. So she's not trying to announce her presence. She's just desperate for a solution. And she thinks, if I can just touch his clothes as he passes by, just like so many others are doing, maybe that'll be my solution. Verse 29, and immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. As soon as she touches Jesus' clothes, she's healed. I mean, like that. She's endured torment for 12 years, and in an instant, she's healed. Verse 30, and Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, who touched my garments? I love this. I love Jesus. Again, Jesus doesn't need information. He's omniscient. But he asks questions not for his sake, but for their sake. You see, Jesus is not willing to simply let her fade back into the background. He knows that she touched him. It says that power had gone out from him, and Jesus stops. He pauses. Right? He asks, who touched my garments? He's not letting this woman just fade back into obscurity. He is calling her into the light. And I love the disciples' response in verse 31. It says, his disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing around us, and yet you say, who touched me? Right? The disciples aren't having it. Like, what are you talking about, Jesus? What do you mean who touched you? Man, everybody touched you. Right? The crowd is pressing in on all sides. What do you mean, who touched you? But Jesus is not letting it go. Right? Verse 32, he looked around to see who had done it. He's looking. He's waiting for the woman to come to him. The woman knows what she has to do, and so she answers Jesus' call. Right? Verse 33. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. Remember, this woman is not supposed to be anywhere near the crowd, let alone touching the most holy person in the crowd. And so she's terrified. I mean, she's afraid, she's trembling, and yet she comes. She comes and she falls down at Jesus' feet, and she tells him everything. She tells him her condition, her fear, her failures, her sin. Verse 34, and Jesus said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. You see, church, Jesus didn't want just to heal her physically, but he wanted to restore her socially. By calling her out, he publicly restores her to the community. They can attest that she's been cleansed, and he heals her relationally. He doesn't just call her woman, he calls her daughter. He gives her a new identity as his child. Which is interesting because this entire episode that's happening right now, it's happening while Jairus is begging Jesus to come and to keep his daughter from dying. But Jesus calls the woman daughter. And then he says to her, your faith has made you well. He wants her to know, listen, I know you were thinking if you can just touch me. I know you were thinking, if you could just grab my clothes, that you'll be healed. But I need you to understand, your hand did not heal you, your heart did. It was your faith that made you well. This woman's story is an interruption. But it's an interruption with an important lesson. You see, Jesus is teaching Jairus something through her. She becomes a model of faith. And Jairus needs to see it because he's about to get some really bad news. Verse 35, while he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? I mean, can you receive any worse news as a parent? Jairus has been doing everything he can. He has humiliated and humbled himself in front of everyone, just to have a chance to save his little girl. And yet still she dies. And so they tell him, why bother the teacher? Just let Jesus go do something else. But Jesus hones in on this moment. He's locked in on Jairus' response. And he looks at Jairus. He says in verse 36, but overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. Jesus says, don't listen to them. You listen to me. Do you trust me? Don't fear, only believe. The messengers say the girl is dead. Jesus ignores them. He heard the news, but he refuses to accept the assumed outcome. He accepts the reality of death, but he denies that death is going to have the final word. In fact, Jesus gives a command. He commands Jairus to believe. Two commands, actually. There's a negative command. First, don't fear. Right? Don't do that. Stop doing that. But secondly, believe. Or actually, the word here is keep believing. Jesus' miracle was delayed. It was interrupted while God was helping someone else, but it wasn't done without intent. It was meant to build within Jairus a faith that could withstand even the worst possible news. Jesus in this passage presents himself as the interruptible one. He did not neglect the lowly, the unclean, the anonymous woman in order to impress the respected and prominent religious official. Jesus shows the worth and the love that he has for every individual, no matter how insignificant or invisible they might feel in the crowd. So what are some things we can take away from this morning, church? One, trust the interruptible God. Jesus prioritizes people over schedules and status. There is nobody in this room this morning who is too small, who is too unclean for Jesus' attention. Even in the middle of an emergency like Jairus', Jesus stops to embrace and to lift up the one who reaches out in secret. Trust the interruptible God. Second, we got to move from something to someone. Right, this passage calls us away from the genie in a bottle Jesus and into a personal relationship with Jesus. The woman wanted a cure. She wanted to slip away quietly. Jesus insisted on a personal encounter, and he pronounced her as his daughter. What about your faith? Is your faith transactional? Is it superstitious? Are you just trying to grab Jesus' garment when he's looking at your heart? The woman fell at his feet and told him the whole truth. And Jesus says that by her faith, she was healed of her disease. She was made new. She was brought into his family, and she was left at peace with God. Perhaps some of you need to do that this morning. Third, choose faith over fear. When human circumstances say it's over, believers are called to follow Jesus' example, to hear the report, but not accept the finality of it. We are to believe and to keep believing. We are to hold on to faith as a radical trust which will carry us from despair and to hope. Choose faith over fear. We've seen the reality of dead ends. We've seen the necessity of persistent faith through delays. And lastly, church, I want us to see the authority of Jesus to restore wholeness. Look at verse 37. And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. And they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue. And Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, and he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him, but he put all of them outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. And taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. See, Jesus continues with Jairus to his house. But at this point, he sends the crowd away. Remember, the crowds have been following him. At this point, he says, y'all need to go. He sends the crowds away. He takes Peter and James and John. Can you just imagine the scene that these men are walking into? Right, we get a description of it in verse 38. It says, they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. This is a place of weeping and wailing. This is, a child has just died. They're entering a place of hopelessness, a place of despair. Verse 39, and when he had entered, he said to them, why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him, but he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and he went in where the child was. Jesus walks in and he says, what are y'all doing? Why are y'all making all this noise? She's not dead, she's sleeping. All right, they laugh at him, they mock him. And so he puts them all outside. He takes all the mourners, the visitors, the family members, everyone except the child's mother and father and his disciples, and he sends everyone else away. And don't miss this, we've been talking about Jairus, but the mother has not been absent from this scene. Right? She's right here. While Jairus has been running around looking, trying to find Jesus, it's been the mother holding her dying daughter's hand. She's been the one kneeling beside her corpse. She's been the one living in the house of weeping and wailing. And maybe you've been there too. But now Jesus has come. Verse 41. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha Kumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age, and they were immediately overcome with amazement. Jesus grabs her little hand, right? This tender movement, this familiar one, a movement that actually would have made Jesus ceremonially unclean, right? He's touching a corpse. But Jesus takes her hand, and you can almost see him leaning down and saying, little girl, get up. And just immediately, just as immediately as the woman was healed, this little girl immediately gets up and starts walking. And Mark says the parents were overcome with amazement, and I just don't think that phrase adequately describes the party and the celebration that was probably taking place in that room. In verse 43, he strictly charged them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. When Jesus enters the room, death does not have the final word, church. He's not trying to impress the crowds. He wants to restore a family. He takes those things that we see as dead ends in our life and he treats them as nothing more than a nap. And just like any good mother, what does Jesus tell the parents to do when she gets up? Get her something to eat. What do we learn from this, church? What can we take away? A couple things here as we close. Jesus has authority over what you think is final. Everybody in that house thought the story was over. The mourners were already weeping. The funeral process had already begun. In their minds, death had already won. And so they laugh at Jesus. And church, sometimes we do the same thing. We look at broken marriages. We look at prodigal children. We look at addictions, bitterness, anxiety, depression, years of spiritual wandering. And we make a conclusion. It's too far gone. We see dead ends and final chapters, but Jesus walks into the situation that we call hopeless, and he says, you don't see what I see. The same Jesus who took a dead girl by the hand is still able to bring life where we see only death. And some of you this morning need to stop treating your situation like Jesus has already lost. If Christ conquered sin, Satan, and the grave, then nothing in this life is beyond his authority. His authority over what you think is final. Secondly, let Jesus into the rooms that you've closed off. Notice where Jesus goes. He walks straight into the house of mourning. into the room that nobody else could fix, into the place that was filled with grief and tears and hopelessness. And many of us have rooms like that in our lives, rooms that we've closed off, areas of hurt and of shame and of disappointment, places where we have quietly accepted defeat. But Jesus cannot restore what we refuse to surrender. Jairus had to let Jesus into the house. The parents had to let Jesus into the room. And some of you today need to let Jesus into the places that you've been trying to manage on your own. Today you need to bring your grief to him. Bring your fears to him. Bring your failures to him. Bring him the parts of your life that feel lifeless and cold. Because he is the one who specializes in walking into dead places and bringing out life. Let him into those rooms you've closed off. And lastly, remember that Jesus does more than rescue. He restores. I love the tenderness of verse 43. Right, again, just after this incredible miracle, Jesus says, get her something to eat. Why? Jesus is not distant or detached from our lives. He doesn't just perform miracles and walk away, but he restores people fully. He cares even about the small things, the practical things, the everyday things. Church, Jesus doesn't merely save souls in the abstract sense, but he restores lives. He gives peace. He gives joy. He restores fellowship and hope. And one day, for every believer in Christ, that restoration is going to be complete. The same Savior who told this little girl, arise, will one day speak again, and every grave belonging to his people will answer his voice. Death does not get the final word. Jesus does. And so Mark sandwiches these two stories together for a reason. The woman came broken and left in peace. Jairus came fearful and left amazed. Why? Because when Jesus enters the scene, hopelessness does not get the final word. And maybe for you this morning, you feel that you've come to a dead end. Spiritually dead, emotionally exhausted. You're buried under shame or fear or sin or grief. And I just need you to hear me clearly. That Jesus still says to us, do not fear, only believe. The same Savior who healed the unclean woman, who raised Jairus' daughter, is the same Savior who went to the cross for sinners, who died in our place, and who 3 days later walked out of the grave in victory. And now he offers to you, he offers to all of us forgiveness and cleansing and restoration and eternal life to all who would come to him by faith. So I just beg you, come to Jesus today. Fall at his feet today. Bring your whole truth to him today. And trust the one who still brings life out of dead places. Would you all pray with me?